Midway through the flight, just as the soft hum of the engines blended into the background and most passengers had settled into the dull rhythm of air travel, a sharp sound cut through the cabin. It was the unmistakable click of metal. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. A black teenage girl sat frozen in her seat near the middle of the plane as a flight attendant fastened a pair of handcuffs around her wrists. For a moment, no one fully understood what they were seeing. Then the reality hit, and a wave of shock rippled through the rows. The girl couldn't have been more than 16. She wore a simple hoodie, jeans, and large headphones that had been resting over her ears just seconds earlier. Her backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her, untouched. According to the crew, she had been disruptive. That was the word they used, spoken loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, yet vague enough to explain nothing at all. Disruptive how, people wondered. She hadn't stood up. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even removed her headphones until the attendant tapped her shoulder sharply and demanded her attention. Her eyes were wide now, darting from one uniform to another, searching for understanding. Fear slowly replaced confusion as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. She tried to speak, her voice trembling as she asked what she had done wrong, but her words were brushed aside. One attendant gestured toward the aisle, another radioed someone unseen, and a third stood with arms crossed as if guarding her from escape. The plane, once filled with the ordinary noises of travel, fell into an uneasy silence. Phones came out almost instinctively. A man across the aisle lifted his device, hesitating for a split second before hitting record. A woman a few rows back whispered, "This doesn't feel right," to her seatmate. Others stared straight ahead, uncomfortable but unsure whether to intervene. The girl's hands trembled against the cold metal cuffs, and she swallowed hard, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. She had never been in trouble before. She didn't even fully understand what disruptive meant in this moment. One of the attendants repeated the accusation, her tone sharp and rehearsed, as if this explanation alone should be enough. When the girl tried again to explain that she had simply been listening to music, that she hadn't spoken to anyone, the response was a warning to stay quiet. The imbalance of power was suffocating. She was young, restrained, and surrounded by authority figures who had already decided she was a problem. The tension in the cabin thickened. A middle-aged passenger finally spoke up, asking calmly what rule the girl had broken. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. The attendant answered with a clipped response about crew discretion and safety concerns, words that sounded official but empty. Another passenger shook his head slowly, his jaw tight, clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. The girl's breathing grew shallow. She stared down at her lap, the cuffs digging slightly into her skin, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes. She thought of her father. She thought of how he had reminded her to keep her boarding pass safe, to stay polite, to enjoy the flight. She wondered if anyone would believe her if she said she hadn't done anything wrong. As the crew prepared to escort her out of the seat, unbuckling her belt without asking, the sense of injustice became impossible to ignore. Murmurs spread. Someone whispered the word, profiling. Another passenger muttered, "This is messed up." Still, the attendants continued, faces stiff, movements efficient, as if this were just another routine task on a checklist. Then, from the front of the plane, a man stood up. He moved with a calm that felt out of place in the charged atmosphere. He was tall, dressed neatly in a dark jacket, and his expression was controlled but focused. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or argue. He simply stepped into the aisle and asked one clear question that sliced through the tension like a blade. "Why is my daughter in handcuffs?" The words echoed. The cabin froze. For a second, the crew didn't respond. One attendant let out a short, nervous laugh, assuming perhaps that this was a misunderstanding or a bluff. She began to repeat the same explanation about disruption, but the man held up his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. He walked closer, his eyes never leaving the girl, who looked up at him in disbelief. The relief on her face was immediate and overwhelming. Her lower lip trembled as tears finally escaped, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The man reached her seat, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the chaos. He asked again, quieter this time, what rule she had broken. No one answered. Instead, one of the attendants asked him to return to his seat. That was when he reached into his jacket and calmly pulled out his identification. He didn't wave it around. He simply held it up long enough for the nearest crew member to read. Color drained from her face almost instantly. Her posture stiffened. Her confident authority evaporated in a heartbeat. She took a step back. Another attendant leaned in to look, her eyes widening as recognition set in. The whispered communication between them was frantic now, hushed voices filled with panic rather than control. The man wasn't just a concerned parent. He was the CEO of the airline. Within seconds, the energy in the cabin shifted completely. The captain emerged from the cockpit, alerted by hurried messages over the intercom. He took in the scene with one glance and immediately approached, his expression tight with concern. Orders were reversed as quickly as they had been given. The handcuffs were removed, clinking softly as they fell away from the girl's wrists. Apologies came fast and clumsy, overlapping each other, filled with words like misunderstanding and procedure. None of them sounded sufficient. The girl rubbed her wrists, red marks already forming, and leaned into her father as he wrapped an arm around her. The fear that had gripped her moments earlier slowly began to loosen, replaced by exhaustion and disbelief. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some lowered their phones. Others shook their heads, anger simmering beneath the surface. What had just happened was undeniable. The mistake was clear, and so was the reason it had been made. The father said very little. He didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers who had witnessed everything, and then back at the crew, who now stood rigid and ashamed. The flight resumed, but nothing felt normal anymore. As the plane continued its journey, the girl stayed close to her father, her headphones forgotten in her lap. She knew she would never forget this moment. Neither would anyone else on that flight. What began as an ordinary trip had become a powerful reminder of how quickly assumptions can turn into injustice, and how silence can be broken by a single, calm voice at exactly the right moment. As the crew prepared to escort her away, the atmosphere inside the cabin tightened to the point where even breathing felt loud. The girl's seatbelt was unfastened without her consent, and one attendant gestured sharply toward the aisle as if expecting her to stand up immediately despite her wrists being restrained. The murmurs among passengers grew heavier, layered with disbelief and quiet anger, yet no one seemed certain how to stop what was unfolding. It was at that exact moment, just before the situation crossed a line from disturbing to irreversible, that a sharply dressed man rose from his seat in first class. He did not move in haste. His actions were measured, deliberate, and composed, standing in stark contrast to the rushed authority of the crew. He straightened his jacket, stepped into the aisle, and looked down the length of the cabin with steady eyes that missed nothing. There was no shouting, no dramatic gesture, no demand for attention. Yet somehow, the simple act of him standing shifted the energy of the plane. Passengers turned instinctively toward him. Even the crew hesitated, sensing an interruption they hadn't anticipated. The man walked forward slowly, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the carpeted aisle. When he stopped beside the girl's row, he did not immediately look at the attendants. Instead, he looked at her. The fear in her eyes softened just slightly as she recognized him, though confusion and disbelief still clouded her expression. Then he spoke. His voice was calm but firm, clear enough to carry without being raised. "Why is my daughter in handcuffs?" The words landed heavily, as if the air itself had dropped. The attendants froze mid-motion. One had her hand still hovering near the girl's arm, another had already turned toward the aisle, prepared to lead her away. For a brief second, no one responded. The silence was louder than any argument could have been. A nervous laugh broke from one of the crew members, light and dismissive, as though the man had just made an awkward joke. She smiled thinly and began to explain that the passenger had been disruptive, that procedures had been followed, that everything was under control. Her tone was casual, almost patronizing, as if she were reassuring someone who didn't understand how things worked. The man did not interrupt her. He simply listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once, slowly, and asked again, quieter this time, what exactly did she do? The attendant hesitated. She glanced at her colleague, then back at him. Her confidence wavered. She repeated the word disruptive, but it sounded weaker now, stripped of its authority. The man's gaze shifted briefly to the cuffs around his daughter's wrists, then back to the crew. She was listening to music, he said evenly. Seated. Silent. That's what I observed. Another attendant stepped in, her posture defensive, insisting that crew judgment should not be questioned. She suggested that the man return to his seat so the situation could be handled properly. A few passengers audibly scoffed at that. Someone muttered that this was unbelievable. A phone camera zoomed in closer. The man exhaled slowly. There was no anger in his face, but there was something far more unsettling for the crew: certainty. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather case. He opened it without flourish and held it up at chest level, angled so the nearest attendant could see clearly. The smile vanished from her face almost instantly. Her eyes widened, then flicked rapidly across the text, as if rereading it might change what it said. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked up at him again, her expression completely transformed, and then quickly turned the case toward the other attendants. One by one, they leaned in, and one by one, their faces drained of color. The nervous laughter stopped. Whispers broke out among the crew, urgent and panicked now, nothing like the confident murmurs from moments earlier. The word CEO was not spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. Recognition spread faster than turbulence through the cabin. A ripple of stunned realization passed through the passengers as they pieced together what the crew had just learned. The man closed the case and slipped it back into his pocket. He finally placed a hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. She looked up at him, tears welling but no longer spilling, held in place by the reassurance of his presence. Her breathing slowed. The shaking in her hands eased. Within seconds, the tone of the entire situation flipped. One attendant fumbled with the handcuffs, her fingers suddenly clumsy as she worked to unlock them. Another stepped back entirely, her arms dropping to her sides, authority replaced with visible regret. The metallic click echoed softly as the cuffs came off, sounding far louder than they should have in the still cabin. "I'm so sorry," one of them said, the words tumbling out quickly, rushed and unsteady. "There's been a misunderstanding." The man said nothing. The captain emerged from the cockpit moments later, alerted by the frantic communication over the intercom. He took in the scene in silence, his eyes moving from the crew to the girl, to the man standing protectively beside her. His posture stiffened as understanding settled in. He addressed the man respectfully, offering apologies that sounded rehearsed but desperate. Passengers watched with a mix of vindication and anger. Some shook their heads slowly. Others whispered to one another, replaying the moment when the girl had been accused, restrained, silenced. A woman wiped her eyes. A man clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead as if trying to control his fury. The father finally spoke again, his voice still calm, still controlled. He asked why his daughter had been treated as a threat without evidence. He asked why no attempt had been made to de-escalate, to communicate, to respect her as a passenger. Each question was delivered evenly, but each one landed harder than the last. The crew had no real answers. The girl stood carefully, rubbing her wrists where faint red marks were already forming. She leaned into her father, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from fear to exposure. He wrapped an arm around her, grounding her, shielding her from the dozens of eyes now fixed on them. The flight continued, but the illusion of normalcy was gone. The cabin remained quiet, not with the uneasy silence from before, but with something heavier. Awareness, reflection, shame. Everyone aboard understood that what had happened could not be undone, only remembered. As the man returned with his daughter to their seats, he did not look triumphant. There was no satisfaction in his expression. Only resolve. Because while the handcuffs had been removed, the deeper issue they represented remained, etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed how quickly judgment had replaced fairness, and how close injustice had come to walking down that aisle unchecked. The man was the airline's CEO. The realization spread through the cabin in a matter of seconds, though it felt much longer to those standing at the center of the storm. One moment the crew had been rigid with authority, convinced they were in control, and the next their confidence collapsed under the weight of the truth. Faces that had once looked stern now appeared pale and uncertain, eyes darting as if searching for a way to undo what had already been done. The captain rushed out of the cockpit almost immediately, alerted by hurried, panicked messages over the intercom. His steps were quick, far quicker than protocol usually allowed, and his expression was tight with concern. He took in the scene at a glance: the teenage girl standing stiffly beside her seat, wrist still marked by the pressure of the cuffs, the man beside her with one arm protectively around her shoulders, and the crew frozen in place, caught between authority and accountability. Security officers who had been moving forward moments earlier slowed, then stopped entirely. They exchanged uncertain looks before quietly stepping back, suddenly aware that their presence was no longer needed and might only make things worse. The shift was unmistakable. Power had changed hands without a single raised voice. The captain spoke first, his tone respectful and carefully measured. He addressed the man directly, offering an apology that came quickly but felt heavy, burdened by the knowledge that words alone could never fully repair the damage. The man listened without interrupting, his face composed but unreadable. He did not nod. He did not react. His focus remained on his daughter, who stood silently, trying to process how rapidly her fear had transformed into something closer to disbelief. The cuffs were removed at last, the sound of metal unlocking echoing through the quiet cabin. It was a small sound, but it carried enormous weight. Several passengers flinched when they heard it, as if that click had sealed the moment into memory. The girl flexed her fingers slowly, rubbing her wrists where red marks had already begun to form. Her hands were still shaking, but she was free. She turned to her father then, and the composure she had been clinging to finally cracked. She hugged him tightly, burying her face against his chest, and he held her just as firmly, one hand resting on the back of her head, grounding her. For a brief moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear for them both. There were no uniforms, no accusations, no eyes watching. Just relief, raw and overwhelming. Apologies poured in from every direction. Flight attendants spoke over one another, their voices rushed and strained, repeating the same phrases again and again. Misunderstanding, procedure, safety concerns. None of it sounded convincing now. Each word felt smaller than the last, shrinking under the scrutiny of the passengers who had witnessed everything from the beginning. The captain attempted to restore order, addressing the cabin and assuring everyone that the situation was being handled. But there was no restoring what had been broken. Passengers looked at one another with expressions that ranged from anger to quiet reflection. Some shook their heads slowly. Others stared straight ahead, jaws clenched, as if holding back words they wished they had spoken earlier. The father finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He asked simple, direct questions. Why was his daughter restrained without clear cause? Why was no attempt made to de-escalate? Why was silence mistaken for defiance? Each question landed heavily, forcing the crew to confront the reality of their actions rather than hide behind protocol. No one had a satisfactory answer. The girl remained close to her father, her grip on his jacket firm, as if afraid that letting go might somehow pull her back into the nightmare she had just escaped. She glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of strangers who now looked at her with sympathy, regret, and, in some cases, shame. She wondered how many of them had believed she was guilty when the accusation was first made. Security retreated fully, returning to their original positions as quietly as possible, their earlier certainty replaced by visible discomfort. The attendants stepped back as well, suddenly unsure of where to stand, what to do, how to exist in the aftermath of a mistake that could not be erased. They had followed their assumptions without question, and now those assumptions stood exposed. The flight resumed, but nothing felt the same. The usual announcements sounded hollow. The hum of the engines felt louder, heavier. Passengers replayed the incident in their minds, some wondering what might have happened if the man had not stood up, if the girl had been traveling alone, if no one with power had been there to interrupt the narrative that had already been written for her. The father sat with his daughter, speaking softly to her, reassuring her that she was safe. She nodded, though her eyes remained distant, still processing the humiliation and fear she had endured. She would remember this moment for a long time, not just for how it ended, but for how quickly it had begun, how easily she had been reduced to a problem without proof. The crew moved through the cabin more cautiously now, their earlier confidence replaced with restraint. Every glance toward the father and daughter carried the unspoken understanding that this incident would not end when the plane landed. Reports would be written. Conversations would be had behind closed doors. Consequences would follow. Passengers sensed it too. The mistake had not only embarrassed the crew, it had exposed something deeper, something systemic. The realization settled heavily in the cabin. This was not just one error. It was a reflection of how easily bias could slip into judgment, how quickly authority could be misused when unchecked. As the flight continued toward its destination, the story was already spreading. Messages were being typed. Videos were being uploaded. What had happened mid-air would not stay there. The world would see it, dissect it, debate it. But for the girl, none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the warmth of her father's embrace and the certainty that, at least this time, someone had stood up in time. The crew knew it too. Their mistake had not gone unnoticed, and it had not gone without cost. In that silent cabin, surrounded by witnesses, they realized that the authority they once wielded so confidently had shattered in an instant. And no apology, no matter how many times it was repeated, could fully undo what had already been seen, recorded, and remembered by everyone on board.